In this clip I'm going to talk about God, at least my understanding of God. There's a great quote in Buber's book, I and Thou, about the importance of discussing God rather than just dismissing the whole notion. Some would deny any legitimate use of the word God because it has been misused so much. Certainly it is the most burdened of all human words. Precisely for that reason, it is the most imperishable and unavoidable. In a way, it's like not talking about love, because love has been abused and misunderstood and misapplied for so long. But that bespeaks the importance of a critical analysis of the notion as well. So let's just launch into it. In the Hebrew Bible, the two main names for God, or the two primary characteristics by which God goes, are YHVH, sometimes pronounced with the vowels Jehovah, and Elohim. YHVH is often translated as the Lord or the Eternal. It's based on the Hebrew root HYH, Haya, which means to be. So it's a name that denotes existing. The other name of God is Elohim, which is a plural noun, and the singular is also a name of God, which is El. One of the translations of El is power or strength. So in a way, Elohim represents the constellation of powers which are subsumed under that aspect of God. The name of God that appears in the creation story is Elohim. And so this implies that this is the characteristic or the nature, the attribute of God, which created and sustains the laws of nature and the objects in the natural world that those laws act upon. In a way, Elohim is a more impersonal nature or aspect or quality of God, persona as you will, which is a strict applier of cause and effect once the laws of nature are established. And the laws of nature and the laws of morality and ethics are also created by Elohim. They continue to operate. Therefore, there's the creation of the laws and their maintenance. It's rather mechanical, mechanistic in a way, the operations of Elohim. There's reward, there's punishment, there's cause and effect. On the other hand, the attribute of YHVH is more of the personal God, rather than the transcendent God which created and sustained the laws of nature, the heavens, the earth, the celestial bodies, the orbits. YHVH is the more personal God, the more personal aspect of God, the one with which humans usually interact, and in particular the prophets. So YHVH is the name of God to which the sacrifices are made. The aspect of God that accepts repentance, that forgives, that intervenes in the laws of nature to create miracles when the time calls for them. There's a notion that if the world were run only through Elohim, let's say, there would be no chance for humanity's survival because of man's wicked nature. That cause and effect, reward and punishment would make an end of humans. But because of the compassionate, forgiving, generous, loving aspects of God represented by YHVH, the world continues. So how did I come to my beliefs? Well, I came to my beliefs through decades of study and practice of Zen Buddhism. So the underlying teaching of Buddhism is the existence of cause and effect, which teaches that everything arises, exists, and then passes on, passes away. The relationship between past and present and future are regulated by cause and effect. Everything that's occurring now is a result of what happened before. Everything in the future will be determined by what's happening now. There are a couple of questions, or a number of questions, that Buddhism considers unhelpful for attaining enlightenment. One of them is whether or not there's a God. And another is there something else besides cause and effect? What predated cause and effect, as it were, or what postdates it, what occurs afterwards? Because if cause and effect teaches that everything has a beginning, level, a phase of existence and then an ending, then cause and effect does too. And if everything has antecedent causes, then what caused the arising of cause and effect? So those are the kinds of questions that probably are not useful for enlightenment, but since this isn't a talk about Buddhism, more about God, it's the way, or it's an explanation of why and how I began to think about God. For example, what caused or what created cause and effect, and what sustains cause and effect, which then takes you to what came before cause and effect and what will exist after cause and effect. Now, the notion of existence outside of cause and effect is incomprehensible. It's like what was going on before the Big Bang and what will occur after the Big Crunch. But that doesn't necessarily mean that existence is the wrong word. It just may not be accurate. And it's more accurate to say that something existed before cause and effect than to say that something did not exist before cause and effect, because something had to exist before cause and effect to create it, because the teaching of cause and effect is that everything has antecedent causes. In addition, the laws of cause and effect are not random. They seem to encourage certain behaviors and discourage others. Those laws seem to encourage certain beliefs and discourage others. For example, when you're angry, you develop heartburn, and when you're generous, people like you. Now, there's no reason inherently for those relationships between cause and effect to exist. In other words, they reflect the wishes or the desires or the design or the mind of the creator and sustainer of cause and effect. In other words, cause and effect is so designed to encourage generosity and to discourage anger. Therefore, when trying to understand what is God's nature, what does God want, why did God make things the way that they are, one can start to infer what those are through an observation of the natural world and the moral ethical world. You see what's encouraged and what's discouraged, and therefore you start to get a sense of God's plan, as it were. Now, what's interesting about the Hebrew Bible is it's a prophetic text, which means it was delivered prophetically. In other words, it's a verbal interaction between humans and God. And the text is a manual, a laying down, a schematic, as it were, of the relationship between creation and God. So it isn't as if you need to reinvent the wheel every time you're wondering about what to do or what decisions to make. The narratives and the laws and the wisdom contained in the Hebrew Bible both work at a microcosmic level and a macrocosmic one. The narratives, let's say, interactions between two people in the text, are examples of the activity of the moral ethical laws. And on a larger scale, the development of history, the sequence of the historical process on a larger scale is a playing out of cause and effect, reward and punishment, the way things are established or set up for either our benefit or for our harm. In other words, they provide a blueprint for the optimal way of living and thinking. Health, society, the environment. One of the stumbling blocks when people talk about God is the idea or the notion of a vengeful God, an angry God, a petty God, which can be subsumed under the concept of reward and punishment. But if you look at reward and punishment as simply an anthropomorphizing of cause and effect, it might be an easier concept to begin to accept and work with, to begin being curious about and studying and investigating in order for the world to be a better place. By anthropomorphizing, I mean that if a person were to do the kinds of things that occur in the natural or the moral ethical world, then certain emotions or characteristics would be assumed as occurring in that person. So, for example, if out of nowhere there's an earthquake or a plague or a war, then one could say that those are the workings of God, that God is angry, God's wreaking havoc. But if you step back a bit and look at those phenomenon from the perspective of cause and effect, a plague, for example, is the result of certain behaviors. In other words, a plague or an earthquake would be the result of certain consequences of antecedent behaviors. For example, bad sanitation, not letting the fields lie fallow for a year, not being generous, not being sanitary, just not looking after one's self and one's fellow in the way which is laid down in the text. So those consequences of so-called bad behavior are not God punishing us per se, but if you want to anthropomorphize, you could say that God established those laws which are inexorable generally and cannot be superseded. In other words, God created those laws of cause and effect in order to encourage certain behavior and discourage others. So it isn't that God is acting up or mad or whatnot, but that those are the natural consequences of living in a certain way. Another concern is that of the genderization of God, the use of the male pronoun in describing God or talking about God. Now, as much as anything, that's a function of the Hebrew language, which, like the Romance languages, for example, Spanish, does not have a gender-neutral pronoun for the second and third person. In other words, everything is he or she, or everything, including verbs, nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, are either feminine or masculine. And like Spanish, for example, the default gender is male. So clearly, when we're talking about a notion as incomprehensible and as vast as God, it's impossible really to assign genitals to God. But it's just the more convenient way, the more default scope of the language to refer to God in the masculine. In my prophetic states book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, I switch between he and it. When God speaks to humans, I prefer using the pronoun he. But when I'm talking about or I'm translating text that's just so incomprehensibly vast, for example, the creation of the heaven and the earth, I'll use the pronoun it. It just makes more sense. The employ of anthropomorphizing is meant to allow as many people as possible access to the information contained in the text. There's a rabbinic notion that the Bible speaks in the language of man. So most people are not philosophers, not Buddhists, not people who have really studied abstract concepts of karma, cause and effect, and the like. So to treat God as a person or as a person-like thing is much easier to accept and to work with than more abstract ideas about the laws of nature and the like. It's easier, therefore, to use the word hand as God's hand, for example, than to use the notion of God's authority or power or responsibility, or to talk about God speaking or God's mouth as describing the phenomenon of the prophetic state, of the prophetic experience, of the reception of verbal information through prophecy. What then is God like? Well, we can never know God directly, and we can never become God. The notion of us becoming God, when you think about it, is reduced to silliness when you consider what we're talking about when we speak about God. We can approach God by becoming more God-like in our actions and our beliefs. We can perceive God's glory, which I'll talk about at some other point, which is probably what people are seeing when they are envisioning the white light, that it's a reflection of God. But it certainly is not God, who is invisible. One of the philosophers I like a lot is Maimonides, who wrote in the 1200s. And he repeatedly states in his book of Jewish philosophy that God is not a body nor a force within a body. So that pretty much excludes everything in the phenomenal world. So to talk about merging with God, becoming God, God is us, we are God, that's kind of ridiculous. But we can approach God. We can be like God. We can get close to God. We can pray to God. But becoming God is really not part of the system of thought laid down in the text. We can infer what God is like through watching or observing and studying the laws of nature and the laws of ethics and morality. In other words, these are the ways that God interacts with the phenomenal world, which is called providence, which takes place through intermediaries, which are the angels, and so on. But, for example, through the study of the text and the observation of the consequences of not living a so-called godly life, there are famines, there are plagues, there is war, there's strife, there's illness, old age, disease, and death. So one can infer God's qualities through an observation of the phenomenal world. There are quite a lot of resistances to the notion of God as articulated or laid down in the Hebrew Bible, and I'll return to it repeatedly in the course of my discussion of the Torah portions in the book of Genesis. So this is just the first rather densely packed introduction, discussion of the concept. So if you liked this video, please like it on YouTube and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, thank you.